Welcome to episode 7 of Our Vices, where we explore the tenure of each vice president in 3 simple questions. Question number 1. How did John C. Calhoun become vice president? Born in 1782, Calhoun grew up in a family of anti-federalists in South Carolina. Calhoun attended Yale University, where he first gained exposure to the Federalist philosophies of New England, and gained esteem even from his teachers and adversaries for his ability to debate. It is likely here that Calhoun first heard a reasoned argument for the legality of secession from the Union. This detail will become important later on. In 1807, Calhoun passed the South Carolina bar, and soon afterwards won a seat in the State House of Representatives. In 1810, he won his election for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he became an outspoken advocate for war against the United Kingdom. When the war broke out in 1812, James Monroe, James Madison's Secretary of State, took notice of Calhoun, and when Monroe became president in 1817, he appointed Calhoun his Secretary of War, wherein Calhoun wanted to court-martial his subordinate, General Andrew Jackson, for his unsanctioned war with Spanish Florida. Monroe refused to follow through on this request. This exchange remained clandestine for some years to come. Calhoun served in this position for 7 years, leading up to the 1824 election, signaling the end of the era of good feelings. Many in President Monroe's inner circle threw their hat in the ring in a bid to be Monroe's successor, each one being some form of Republican. That is, the party we now call Democratic Republicans. The Federalist Party having withered away, no longer able to field a national candidate, the Democratic Republicans, at the height of their power, fell about themselves and broke up into lesser alliances. Calhoun's rivals were General Jackson, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, Speaker of the House Henry Clay, and Secretary of the Treasury William Crawford. Adams and Calhoun were friends. Adams viewed himself as the heir apparent and felt somewhat slighted by Calhoun's presidential ambitions. Oddly enough, Calhoun found that he had wide support in several regions, but not for the job of president. With an already crowded field of candidates, Calhoun overwhelmingly seemed to be the leading candidate for vice president, and so chose to withdraw his presidential candidacy. In what was truly a one-of-a-kind election, the 1824 election then featured 4 candidates from the same party, divided into alliances, and both the Adams and Jackson camps favored Calhoun as their vice presidential candidate. As a result, John C. Calhoun was the only electoral winner of the 1824 election, easily beating the runner-up 182 vice presidential electoral votes to 30, and he only needed 131 to win. With no presidential winner of the Electoral College, the matter of who would become president fell to the House of Representatives. Andrew Jackson had the plurality of the electoral votes as well as the popular vote. Many assumed he would rightly win the House vote. However, in what will become known as the corrupt bargain, Henry Clay, who finished 4th, and thus below the cutoff for candidates in the House vote, threw his support behind Adams, and when each state's delegation in the House voted as a bloc, Adams won 13 of the 24 states, and with it, the presidency. Now that we have our president and vice president, we move on to question number 2. What did John C. Calhoun do during his time in office? Vice President Calhoun proved quickly to not be an ally of President John Quincy Adams. Calhoun believed that there indeed was a corrupt bargain, wherein Clay became Secretary of State, a job many saw as compensation for swinging his votes over to Adams. Calhoun referred to this incident as
the most dangerous stab which the liberty of this country has ever received.
As you can imagine, much like Thomas Jefferson under John Adams Sr., Calhoun would prove to be a less than helpful vice president. Calhoun had little experience as a presiding officer, which would be a responsibility he now had to fill in the Senate. He studied Jefferson's manual, and despite his differences with the rest of the executive branch, he intended to conduct his duties in the legislative branch to the best of his ability. The oldest member of the Senate had the task of swearing in the vice president. That senator happened to be Andrew Jackson. Calhoun let Jackson know that in his position, he intended to undo the corrupt bargain. Along with Senator Martin Van Buren of New York, the three men would soon form an opposition party to John Quincy Adams and the Adams-Clay faction, with Jackson at the head. Calhoun was the first VP to work under a new set of rules in the Senate, specifying that it was the vice president who was to choose committee chairs. Adams requested Calhoun fill each of these positions with his hand-picked men. Instead, Calhoun went through great pains to distribute these positions fairly and based on merit. Adams also thought it wise to send observers to the Panama Congress, hosted by Simón Bolívar, which had the potential to change the current power dynamics in the Americas. Calhoun made sure to delay the confirmation of the president's proposed observers. Calhoun and other Southerners also didn't care to associate with nations like Haiti, wherein the rebellion of an enslaved population created a nation. Moving into the year 1826, Jackson made it known his intention to run again as president and promised to serve only a single term, which made his candidacy all the more attractive to men like Calhoun and Van Buren, who began building a coalition around Jackson. Meanwhile, the Senate voted to take away the vice president's power to appoint committee positions, reverting to the older system of voting on each position. Calhoun faced criticism for allowing senators to give extended speeches, some would call rants, denouncing President Adams. Calhoun faced new accusations that as Secretary of War, his personal secretary misappropriated funds. Not shying away from controversy, Calhoun immediately excused himself from his Senate duties and demanded that the House of Representatives investigate the matter. Despite the allegation, Van Buren advised Jackson to keep Calhoun as his vice presidential running mate, as Calhoun had clearly demonstrated his electoral viability in the last election. In 1828, Calhoun and many Southerners were incensed by the passing of what they would call the Tariff of Abominations, which drastically increased the price of foreign manufactured goods through a protective tariff. This tariff would benefit the North by inflating the costs of foreign goods, making the products of the industrialized North more competitive on the market. Calhoun, speaking for the agricultural South, argued, however, that the tariff disproportionately favored the North, while bleeding the South of its wealth through artificially higher prices. As vice president, Calhoun penned an anonymous essay entitled the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, to be introduced to the South Carolina House of Representatives. He had 5,000 copies made for distribution. Within his exposition, Calhoun argued that just like how the Supreme Court did not explicitly have the right to judicial review in the Constitution, the individual states did not lose their ability to similarly review the legality of a law. In fact, unlike the Supreme Court, the states could cite the 10th Amendment, reserving for individual states those powers not taken up by the federal government, as the basis for the ability to review federal laws. Calhoun cited the Kentucky Resolution, written by Thomas Jefferson when he was vice president, and the Virginia Resolution, written by James Madison, as precedent for a process called nullification, whereby a federal law could be invalidated by a state legislature that found the law unconstitutional. Calhoun elaborated on how this practice could be integrated into the American system. After a state nullified a law, Calhoun referred to this as a veto. It would move the issue to the federal government to either accept that that particular law was invalid in that state, or push for that law to become a constitutional amendment, which would require 3/4 of all the states to approve. Either the law would fail to become an amendment and remain up to the discretion of each state, or become nationally binding, having been added to the Constitution itself. The process is not entirely without merit, but can you imagine how crippling a state veto would become to the federal government if a single state could nullify any law, leading to either an ignored piece of legislation or a national referendum on amending the Constitution itself? The slow-moving gears of conscientious governance would rust to a stop. The issue doesn't go away, but for now, we must turn to the lead-up to the 1828 election. Unsurprisingly, Adams did not select Calhoun as his running mate. Calhoun's move away from Adams being quite public at this point. Adams said of Calhoun that he was the dupe and tool of every knave, cunning enough to drop the oil of fools in his ear. The party coalescing around Jackson promised to restore Jeffersonian republicanism, of small, responsible government protecting liberty, in contrast to John Quincy's National Republican Party, in which a strong, unified nation supporting one another through national projects and policies they believed would be the best way forward as a nation and raise the quality of life for everyone. Calhoun's followers were an integral ingredient in the Southern contingent of this new Jacksonian party, soon to be known as the Democratic Party. While Jackson had great popularity in the West, Van Buren popular enough in the North to take a bite out of John Quincy's popularity outside of New England. Jackson won the Electoral College in a landslide vote of 178 to 83, and Calhoun retained his position as vice president. Calhoun and George Clinton are the only vice presidents to ever serve under two different presidents. Marring the beginning of Jackson's first term in office, it was John C. Calhoun's wife, Fluoride, who initiated a scandal referred to as the Petticoat Affair. Fluoride had long served as an essential element of her husband's rise to prominence in Washington, D.C. A renowned hostess, invitation to one of her parties became a mark of making it in D.C., of acceptance by the elite. Together with John, they were an ascending power couple, and since President Jackson was a widower, Fluoride was the highest-ranking woman in town, which is why Jackson's Secretary of War, John Eaton, and his new wife, Peggy, called upon Fluoride. Calling upon someone involved visiting them at their home in a formal and yet intimate way to introduce yourself to someone. For the Eatons, if all went well and Fluoride wished to develop a friendship with Peggy, Fluoride and John would return the call and visit the Eaton household. Well, Fluoride never returned the call, which effectively meant the Eatons would be shunned from socializing among the high society of D.C. You see, Peggy was a widow, and many believe she remarried too soon after the death of her husband. Some even believe that her husband killed himself because of an affair Peggy was having with her future husband, John. Pure speculation. Additionally, Peggy came from the lower rung of the social order in D.C., as she was a mere worker in a boarding house. The wives of politicians loathed the unattached women who worked in the establishments their husbands might frequent. And worse yet, she was young, funny, charming, and musically talented. Unfortunate for the Eatons that Fluoride found Peggy too much of a liability to be in her circle. But not the end of the world, until the wives of the men in Jackson's cabinet split into cliques, one pro-Peggy, the other pro-Fluoride. And then the husbands followed suit. Jackson's secretaries were refusing to be in meetings with one another, putting real stress on the functioning of the executive branch. It would be Martin Van Buren, a widower, who would resolve the issue by hosting his own parties and introducing Peggy himself to high society, destroying Fluoride's position as gatekeeper and very intentionally hurting Calhoun's clout in the community. In 1830, Jackson and Calhoun attended a party commemorating Thomas Jefferson's birthday, with the subject of nullification ever present. Jackson gave a toast declaring, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." Calhoun's response was to toast, "The union, next to our liberty, the most dear." Coincidentally, an ally of Van Buren let it be known to President Jackson that under President Monroe, Calhoun, as Secretary of State, sought to court-martial Jackson for his invasion of Florida. Jackson asked Calhoun about the incident, which Calhoun confirmed and informed the president that at the time, Calhoun was Jackson's superior and that Jackson's invasion was indeed unauthorized. Jackson replied to Calhoun that, until now,
I had the right to believe that you were my sincere friend.
Calhoun went so far as to publish his own account of Jackson's actions in Spanish Florida and his response as Secretary of State, so that the informed public could judge each man's actions for themselves. By 1830, Calhoun believed a split from Jackson would be necessary at some point in order to better his chances for the presidency in 1832. Jackson developed the opinion that many of his presidential woes were caused one way or another by Calhoun. In February of 1832, Calhoun published a statement formally disassociating himself from Jackson. Meanwhile, Calhoun's exposition on a state veto had grown into something known as the nullification crisis, which by the year 1830 occasionally broke out in debates on the Senate floor, where Calhoun had to remain somewhat aloof on the subject, but many assumed that he was in league with his South Carolina compatriots. In 1832, the growing South Carolina Nullifier Party consumed state politics, and the conversation over a state veto progressed into a debate over the legality of secession. Violence broke out in Charleston, and James Monroe himself wrote to Calhoun about the dangers of secession. Calhoun felt compelled to reveal that he was the author of the 1828 Exposition, in an attempt to gain control over the movement and lead it back to reason, knowing full well that this disclosure would likely destroy his presidential aspirations. But in South Carolina, the nullifiers had momentum not completely under Calhoun's direction. In October of 1832, the state legislature called for a nullification convention concerning the tariff of abominations. Held in November of 1832, they declared the tariff nullified beginning in February of 1833, and that if President Jackson were to use force to compel the enforcement of the tariff without a national referendum as outlined in Calhoun's exposition, South Carolina would have cause to secede from the Union. At the same time, the South Carolina legislature appointed John C. Calhoun to be their senator. Calhoun accepted the position and resigned his office as vice president, December 28, 1832. Now a senator, Calhoun received word that Jackson intended to arrest multiple leaders of the Nullifier Party on charges of treason. He quickly worked with Henry Clay to create a compromise to mollify the nullifiers and perhaps preserve the Union in the process. Which brings us to question number 3. What was the legacy of Calhoun's time in office? First and foremost, Calhoun more than anyone shaped the intellectual argument of Southern secession, based around states' rights. I don't know if you're a history buff or not, but once that conversation merges with an effort to maintain the institution of slavery, the nation found itself in a bit of a kerfluffle. Pardon my language. One, by the way, Calhoun predicted in the later years of his life, but did not live to see. Secondly, as vice president, Calhoun helped to create the Democratic Party, which he quickly left, only to rejoin years later. In terms of tie-breaking votes in the Senate, Calhoun racked up a record 31 votes, only broken by Kamala Harris, and he is the only vice president to break a tie to defeat a presidential initiative. He did this when he denied Van Buren the position of ambassador to the United Kingdom. Lastly, it is worth noting that for Calhoun, the vice presidency represented only the middle of his long career in the Senate, his previous role as Secretary of War, and his time under President Tyler serving as Secretary of State. But as vice president, Calhoun certainly used his influence and occasionally voting power to limit the power of the executive branch, helping to usher in what many consider the golden age of the U.S. Senate during the antebellum era, where Calhoun and other senators enjoyed great influence over U.S. policy, while the presidents from the same time tend to rank low in retrospect compared to their forefathers and successors. Calhoun's successor will be the subject of our next episode. If you listened closely to this episode, I bet you could guess his name. But we must say goodbye to John C. Calhoun, easily one of the most influential, famous, might I say infamous, vice presidents in American history.